It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. My son Brian was getting married. After all the years of nurturing him, guiding him, and supporting him, this was the moment I had been waiting for, a milestone in both our lives. I had envisioned this day for years. It was supposed to be a day to celebrate, to rejoice in the joy of family, to see my son start his own journey with the woman he loved. I had spent months helping him plan, trying to make everything perfect. The venue was beautiful and elegant ballroom with towering white lily and gold accents. I spent countless hours making sure everything was organized, from the guest list to the flowers to the food. I wanted to make it special, something he would remember for the rest of his life. After all, he was my only son, and he deserved the best. The day of the wedding finally arrived, and I woke up early, my heart full of anticipation. I'd put on my dress, something simple but elegant, and carefully applied my makeup, trying to calm my nerves. I had always dreamed of this day, but now I was anxious. My thoughts kept drifting to what Brian would be like as a husband, and to the future he was about to embark on. But despite all the preparations, despite all the excitement in the air, something felt off. It was a strange sensation, an unease I couldn't shake. Brian had been distant in the weeks leading up to the wedding. He had seemed more preoccupied with his fiancée Sarah than with me. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the stress of planning a wedding. After all, it was a huge occasion for him. That deep down, I could sense that something wasn't quite right. I had always been close with Brian. He had always turned to me for advice, for help, for support. I had been his mother, his confidant, his biggest cheerleader. But as the wedding drew nearer, I felt a growing distance between us. It wasn't just the lack of communication. It was the subtle ways he pulled away. He didn't need me anymore, or so it seemed. When we arrived at the venue, the first thing I noticed was how Sarah, his bride, was running around managing everything. She was in control, coordinating the bridesmaids, the caterers, the photographers. I watched as she confidently directed people, a far cry from the young girl I had first met, who was shy and uncertain. She had transformed into the perfect bride, someone who seemed to have everything under control. I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy, a strange ache in my chest. This was supposed to be my moment too. I had spent years helping Brian grow, supporting him through every step of his life. But now, it seemed that Sarah was taking over, making all the decisions, guiding him in ways I hadn't anticipated. As the ceremony began, I felt a strange heaviness settle in my chest. Brian, standing at the altar, looked so handsome, so grown up. His smile was radiant, but there was something distant in his eyes, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Sarah walked down the aisle, her white gown trailing behind her, but as I watched them exchange vows, a creeping feeling of disconnect swept over me. My son wasn't mine anymore. He was about to belong to someone else. I tried to push those feelings aside. This was his day, and I was supposed to be happy for him. He had found someone to love, someone to share his life with, and that was a beautiful thing. But still, that nagging feeling remained, a quiet voice in the back of my mind that told me I was losing him. After the ceremony, the reception began, and the atmosphere shifted. The hall was buzzing with excitement, the clinking of glasses, the music filling the air. But in the midst of it all, I felt completely out of place. Guests were milling about, exchanging stories, catching up with one another. But I felt like an outsider in my own son's life. I was no longer the center of his world. I wasn't needed anymore. The evening took an unexpected turn when Sarah approached me. She was smiling, but there was something in her expression that didn't sit right with me. Her voice was sweet, but it didn't carry the warmth I had once hoped to see in her. "Mum," she said, her tone almost too polite. "I'm so glad you're here, but we could really use your help with the dinner service. The caterers are running a little behind and we need someone to make sure everything goes smoothly. Would you mind stepping into the kitchen for a bit?" I stood there, stunned. Me? The mother of the groom? I should have been enjoying the reception, mingling with guests, celebrating my son's big day. But instead, she was asking me to help. Serve food. I tried to mask the shock on my face, to swallow the discomfort that rose in my chest, but I couldn't hide the confusion. "Sarah, I'm the mother of the groom. Shouldn't I be enjoying the evening with everyone else?" I asked, my voice a little too quiet. She looked at me with a tight smile, almost apologetically. "I know, but we really need someone to help. You're great at organizing things, and it'll only be for a little while. I promise you'll still have time to enjoy the rest of the night." I wanted to say no. I wanted to refuse and tell her that I had worked too hard to be treated like an afterthought. But I didn't. I nodded, biting my tongue, trying to push down the bitterness that was quickly rising inside me. I could feel the weight of the situation, like I was invisible, like I was just another person to be used when needed. And so, I found myself in the kitchen, serving food, filling glasses, and arranging trays. It wasn't that I didn't want to help. It was that I had been so focused on being a mother, on being there for my son, that I had never imagined a day like this would come. The mother of the groom, relegated to the background, treated like an employee at her own son's wedding. It was as if I no longer mattered, as if my role in his life had diminished to nothing more than a functional one. I passed through the dining room several times, watching Brian laugh and dance with Sarah and their friends, completely unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. It stung more than I cared to admit. I had given him everything: my time, my energy, my love. And now, I was nothing more than a servant at his wedding. The events of the wedding continued to replay in my mind like a haunting refrain. Each time I thought about that day, I felt my stomach churn. The discomfort I had felt was still very much with me, lingering like a cloud that refused to dissipate. It wasn't just about the wedding, though. It was about everything that had led up to it. The subtle distancing between Brian and me, the growing sense of being an outsider in my own son's life, and ultimately, the unspoken message Sarah had delivered that day, that I no longer had a place in the spotlight of Brian's world. That night, as I lay in bed, I tried to convince myself that it wasn't such a big deal. After all, it was just one day. Brian was getting married. He had his own life to build now, and I couldn't expect things to stay the same forever. He had a new wife, new responsibilities, and new priorities. I knew I should be happy for him, that I should be proud of the man he had become. But every time I closed my eyes, I could see his face so distant, so detached as he danced with Sarah, completely oblivious to the role I had played in making that day a reality. Every time I thought about how I had been forced into the kitchen, serving food, taking care of everything behind the scenes, it stung. It was more than just the physical labor. It was the realization that I was being used, not as the mother of the groom, not as someone to be cherished and respected, but as a tool to make sure the event went off without a hitch. The worst part, I couldn't bring myself to talk to him about it. I couldn't voice the hurt I felt, the deep sadness that swirled within me. I didn't know how to express it, how to explain that I had given him everything, and now I felt like I meant nothing. I had spent my whole life making sure he was happy, making sure he had what he needed, and now it felt like I was being swept aside. The more I thought about it, the more the feelings of bitterness and resentment began to build. I knew that something had to change. I couldn't keep living in this toxic dynamic. where I was only useful when I was needed and discarded when I wasn't. But what could I do? Brian was my son. He was the person I had raised, the person I had cared for, loved, and sacrificed. How could I just walk away from him, from everything we had built together? I spent the next few days wrestling with the decision. The hurt was still raw, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. Brian had changed. He wasn't the young boy who once looked up to me with admiration. He wasn't the man who had once relied on me for guidance and love. He was someone different now. Someone who had a wife, a life of his own, and no room for me in it. And I hated to admit it, but it wasn't just Sarah's influence. It was Brian. He had made the decision to treat me like an afterthought, to use me when it was convenient and ignore me when it wasn't. And that was when I realized that I couldn't just keep going along with it. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own happiness and well-being for someone who didn't appreciate me. I had spent too many years putting everyone else's needs before mine. But it was time to change that. I thought about the company I had worked so hard to build over the years. It wasn't just a business, it was my legacy. I had started from the ground up, putting in countless hours, making strategic decisions, and sacrificing my own comfort to ensure it thrived. I had built up shares in the company, and over time, those shares had increased in value. They represented not just my financial security, but also the years of hard work I had invested. But as I thought about everything that had happened, the wedding, the way Brian had treated me, the way I had been dismissed, I began to realize that I didn't want to leave my legacy in his hands. He didn't deserve it. He had shown me, in the most painful way possible, that he didn't care about the things that mattered to me. The business, the company I had poured my heart and soul into, wasn't important to him. He wasn't interested in carrying on the legacy I had built. So I made a decision. I would sell my shares. I would sell my stake in the company and take control of my own future. I wasn't going to sit idly by and let my son, someone who had no respect for me, take over what I had worked so hard for. I wasn't going to let my legacy be handed to someone who hadn't earned it, someone who had treated me with indifference and disrespect. I called my lawyer and instructed him to prepare the necessary documents to sell my shares to one of the company's competitors. The decision felt like a heavy weight being lifted from my shoulders. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with the money, but I knew one thing. I was no longer going to allow myself to be tied to a business that no longer felt like mine. I was taking my future back. In the days that followed, I started making other changes in my life as well. I began focusing more on myself, on my own happiness. I joined a yoga class, started painting again, something I hadn't done in years, and took short trips to visit friends I hadn't seen in ages. For the first time in years, I was living for me. I wasn't living for Brian or for anyone else. I was living for myself, and it felt liberating. But despite the relief I felt from the decision, there was still a deep sadness that lingered. Weight of what I had done, the decision to cut ties with my son, to walk away from the business, to stop living in the shadow of everyone else's expectations, still hung heavy in my heart. I had made the decision to protect myself, but I knew that it would come with consequences. My relationship with Brian would never be the same. There was no going back. But in that moment, I realized that I had to choose myself. I had spent so many years living for others, sacrificing my own happiness and well-being. Now, it was time to put myself first. The day I sold my shares, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the business. It was about reclaiming my own power. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my life again. I wasn't just a pawn in someone else's game. I wasn't just an afterthought, something to be used when it was convenient. I was someone who deserved respect, someone who deserved love not just from others, but from myself. And so, I stepped into my future, uncertain of what it would hold, but determined to face it on my own terms. The weeks following the sale of my shares were both a relief and a challenge. On the one hand, I felt like I had finally taken control of my life. No longer was I tied to a business that had begun to feel like a burden. No longer was I tied to a son who had stopped seeing me as a mother, and more as a source of convenience. I had freed myself from a world of expectations, from the guilt that had been eating away at me for years. But on the other hand, the loss I felt, the grief, the sadness, the overwhelming sense of abandonment was heavy. As I stood at the window of my apartment, looking out at the skyline of the city I had once poured my heart into, I tried to reflect on everything. The years I had spent building the company, the sacrifices I had made to ensure Brian had a comfortable life. Had it all been worth it? Was it worth all the years of feeling unseen, unappreciated, and, in many ways, invisible? I thought about my life and my choices. I had been so focused on Brian, so absorbed in making sure he succeeded, that I had forgotten about my own needs. I had spent years putting my dreams on hold, sacrificing my own happiness to ensure that he had the best of everything. I had done everything I could to show him love, to give him opportunities, to make sure he never felt like he was lacking. But in the end, he had only taken what I gave him without a second thought. The wedding had been the breaking point. It wasn't just about the way I was treated that day, the way I was forced into serving the guests while Brian danced and laughed. It was about everything leading up to it. The growing distance between us. The way he seemed to care more about his wife's approval than about my feelings. I had tried to push all that aside, to tell myself that it was just a phase, that he was just caught up in his own life. But after that day, I could no longer deny the truth. Brian had changed, and he no longer had a place for me in his life. I had poured my heart into raising him, into making sure he had everything he needed. I had loved him unconditionally, even when he didn't seem to notice. But somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that I deserved love and respect too. I had let him take my love for granted, to the point where it had become a transactional relationship. And as much as it hurt to admit it, I realized that the person who needed to change wasn't just Brian, it was me. The sale of my shares was a turning point, but it wasn't the end of my journey. It wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming my own life, my own sense of self-worth. I had spent so much time thinking that my value came from what I gave to others, that my role in the world was to serve and provide for those around me. But now I realized I had been neglecting the most important person in my life, me. I made a promise to myself that I would start living for me. I would stop putting everyone else's needs before my own. I would start doing the things I had always wanted to do, the things I had put off for years. And I didn't need anyone's approval to do it. The first step was simple. I enrolled in a pottery class. It was something I had always wanted to try, but had never made the time for. I spent the next few weeks learning the delicate art of shaping clay, getting my hands dirty, and feeling the sense of accomplishment as each piece came to life. It was therapeutic, a reminder that I could create something beautiful, something uniquely my own, just as I had once done with my business. Pottery wasn't the only thing I began to explore. I took trips to places I had always dreamed of visiting, reconnected with old friends, and even took up photography as a hobby. For the first time in years, I found myself truly enjoying life. I wasn't doing it for anyone else, I was doing it for me. But as much as I tried to focus on myself, I couldn't completely erase the guilt that lingered. It wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about my relationship with Brian, the mother-son bond that had been so deep and so strong. I couldn't help but think about what had happened between us, the ways I had failed him, and the ways he had failed me. I tried to reach out. I called him several times, but the calls were never returned. When I did get him on the phone, the conversations were short and strained. He told me that he was busy with his new life and that things were complicated. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to push him away further, but I also didn't want to keep pretending that everything was okay. Not one day, I decided to take the next step. I wrote him a letter. It wasn't angry. It wasn't accusatory. It was simply a letter where I put everything down. Everything I had kept buried for so long. I told him how much I loved him, how proud I had been to raise him, and how deeply hurt I was by the way he had treated me. I told him I didn't regret the sacrifices I had made, but I did regret that it had cost me my own happiness. I told him I needed him to understand that I was no longer the same woman who had bent over backward to make him happy. I had changed, and I hoped that one day he would see that I had done everything I could to give him the best life possible. But now, it was time for me to live my own life. I didn't know what I expected from the letter. Maybe I thought it would be the breakthrough we both needed, the moment when everything clicked, and he would finally understand what he had done. Or maybe I just needed to say it, to let go of the guilt, the anger, and the sadness that had been weighing me down. Weeks went by and I didn't hear from him. The silence was deafening. But I didn't regret sending the letter. I didn't regret putting my feelings out there, even if they weren't returned. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had done what was right for me. I had stopped trying to please everyone else and started to focus on my own healing. And then, one day, out of the blue, I received a text message from Brian. "Mom, I got your letter. I don't know what to say, but I'm sorry for everything. I've been an idiot. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm trying to figure out where we went wrong." It wasn't an apology I had expected. It wasn't the grand gesture I had hoped for. But it was a start. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, Brian was beginning to understand what he had lost, and maybe, just maybe, he was ready to try to rebuild what had been broken between us. I didn't reply right away. I needed time to process it, to decide what my next step would be. But for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe things wouldn't ever go back to how they were before. Maybe our relationship would never be the same. But it was a step in the right direction. And that was enough.